Hi, Matt.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Good, good.
I should tell people that you're Matthew Ho, and I really appreciate your being here because, you're kind of in demand. You've done a lot of media appearances at outlets more prominent than Blogging Heads TV. You gained a certain amount of prominence, I guess, a couple of months ago when Barack Obama was trying to decide whether to commit a lot more troops to Afghanistan, which he ultimately did. You were in the news because you had resigned a high-ranking civilian position in Afghanistan. I guess you were the highest-ranking civilian official in a province in Afghanistan, right?
That's correct.
You were in the Foreign Service. Because you didn't think the war was, at least as it was being waged, was productive. Is that fair to say?
I have my differences with the strategy in terms of the actual tactics we're employing on the ground. But for the most part, it was my frustrations were along the lines of what are we doing here and what benefit is this to the United States? The costs of our presence here. What are the American people getting out of it? Mm-hmm. And so it came down to why are we here and for what end? Just as much, if more, as with the strategy. I'm not in agreement with the strategy, as I said, but for me it was more of the cost of this do not add up to the benefits that we're receiving.
Okay. And you, I want to explore all that and what kind of where you think we stand now and what you think the problem has been with the strategy. But I wanted to do a little background. You had been a Marine before you joined the Foreign Service, and you did 2 tours of duty in Iraq. Is that right?
Yes. Actually, I've been in the Marine Corps for about 10 years, both active and reserve. About 8 of those were active duty. I had served in Japan for about 3 years. I have been a combat engineer officer, and then I had been sent to the Pentagon to work for the Secretary of the Navy, and was there for about 1.5 years before I actually left active duty and went to work for the Department of Defense on a State Department team doing reconstruction work in north central Iraq for a year. I then came back, went to work for the State Department as a consultant on the Iraq desk, so worked here in D.C. for the State Department doing Iraq policy for about 5 months or so before I got mobilized with the Marine Corps, because I was still a reservist, and I ended up assuming command of a combat engineer company and going back to Iraq. So a little bit convoluted, but that's kind of my Iraq history experience.
Okay, thanks. And then when you went to Afghanistan, what was the nature of your job there?
Sure. Well, I had been working for the Department of Defense here in Washington when I got the opportunity to join the State Department as I joined the Foreign Service in a limited non-career capacity. So basically, you're deputized into the Foreign Service. They basically bring you on a temporary basis in the Foreign Service, with the option, I guess, of extending into the Foreign Service permanently at a later date. But that wasn't anything that really interested me, because I had no interest in becoming an actual career Foreign Service officer. I wanted to be a career civil servant for the U.S. government, but I didn't want to do it in the Foreign Service. I wanted to do it in other ways. So my first position in Afghanistan was I was posted to the east of the country in Jalalabad, which is roughly halfway between Kabul and the Pakistani city of Peshawar. And it's on like I said, the eastern part of Afghanistan. And I was the acting political advisor to a U.S. Army Brigade commander in that part of the country. And he was responsible for 4 provinces, which totaled about 4.5 million Afghans. And under his command, he had about 5,000 American troops under his command. And so my job was to advise him along the lines of our political efforts in that part of the country. I was there for only about 2.5 months when I got moved down to Zabul province, which is in the south, adjacent to Kandahar, and again on the Pakistan border. And my job there was to be the political advisor to the governor the Afghan governor of the province. So that was working with the governor daily, basically advising him on his political efforts in a province that was completely controlled by the Taliban. So for a guy like me who had watched Lawrence of Arabia for the first time when he was 10 and was enthralled by it, and had been doing this kind of thing for his most of his adult life, this was I'm not going to say it was the best job I ever had, but it was the second best job I ever had. The best job being when I had company command of Marines.
What did you find gratifying about those two jobs? What was okay? So your favorite job was in the Marines in Iraq. What was the most gratifying part of that job?
Just having the privilege of leading 152 Marines and sailors, 152 great young men. Just the privilege of that experience. We were operating in Anbar province in 2006 and 2007, so it was a complete mess when we got there. It was an absolute as bad as anything could possibly be. You couldn't leave. You couldn't roll off your fob. You couldn't go into any of the cities without getting into a firefight. And we were losing out there. We were at one point we were up to we were having one Marine killed every day. So it was pretty bad from IED attacks or rocket attacks or mortar attacks or the snipers, which ended up being tough. So while it was a horrific experience, being in a position where you were responsible for the lives of those men and for bringing them back home, and then all the interaction you have with them, and all those personal moments you have when you're put in a position like that with Marines and sailors, it was just an experience unparalleled, and it's difficult to describe, if you haven't shared in that experience. But it's something unparalleled, and it will be something I'll never have again.
And it has something to do with the way just adversity builds bonds among people. I mean, the idea that you're all in this together, and it's high stakes. The challenges, the obstacles, it's not a Hurt Locker type experience. It wasn't like we're addicted to the thrill of combat or the thrill of war. Trust me, there's nothing good about war. I'm much happier sitting here, in Washington D.C. Than I am, in Anbar province or in southern Afghanistan. But there are aspects about it that if that's what your profession is, if that's what your career is, if that's what you've come to chosen as your path in life, then there are aspects of it that you can't find anywhere else that you find rewarding. But just this idea of being with, leading Marines and sailors, the challenges we had there were immense. The enemy was very resilient and very difficult, very tough. And to get past those and to bring them all back home, it's really just like I said, an experience that's unparalleled. Okay, and then what about your job in Afghanistan? What was it that you found rewarding about that? It was similar. It was the challenges of it. It was while my position in Iraq with the Marine Corps, and also my other job what I had in Iraq, my first year there when I was there from May 04 to May 05 up into Crete. Similarly, same thing too. It was such a challenging, difficult job, and there was a lot of hardship to it. And I hope people who are listening aren't getting me wrong in thinking that I enjoyed the warfare aspect of it, or I enjoyed seeing our young men getting killed and maimed, or I enjoy seeing the other side getting killed and maimed. I certainly do not. It's just the adversity of it, the difficulty of it, the challenge of it is something that is so rewarding. But in Afghanistan, it was the same. It was a difficult challenge. I wasn't leading 152 Marines and sailors. I was just working one-on-one with an Afghan provincial governor. A man who was a close friend of Karzai's, who had been a governor of the province, who got moved to this province, and whose province that he was responsible for, a province of about 300,000 people, was nearly completely controlled by the Taliban. So it was if you grow up studying counterinsurgency, you grow up reading this in history, if you grow up admiring guys like John Paul Bond from Vietnam or in that kind of work, this is your opportunity to do it. This is your opportunity to excel at it. And so I was grateful for that opportunity, and I'm very disappointed that I came to these conclusions that that my assessments, and I had to be honest with myself, but then my assessments were that this wasn't right for us to be involved in Afghanistan. It was right for us in 2001, but we've lost track over the way, and now because of a multitude of reasons, we're here having our young men fight and die in valleys that are meaningless to us, and really just making people's lives here even worse. So it was it was a very rewarding experience. It was a very challenging experience. It was very enjoyable because I liked that type of work.
However, I had to be honest with myself, and my own intellectual assessment of it was that we were wrong to be there.
So what kinds of things did you see there that led you to this conclusion?
It starts, and also too, one thing, we could talk about this later if you want, Bob, but, it certainly wasn't just an Afghan experience for me. This builds and starts for me back in 2002 when I first got assigned to the Pentagon, working at a very senior level, as a fly on the wall, of course, but working at a senior level where I was able to see a lot of things that other guys my age and my career level ordinarily don't get to see.
So, what kinds of things?
Well, just the different briefings. I was the junior captain on the personal staff of the Secretary of the Navy. So you're just privy to different conversations. You're privy to different meetings. You're able to see and work with leadership at extremely high levels. Constantly interacting with the Chief of Naval Operations and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and then of course all their different subordinates at the 3-star level. Are you saying that you started getting doubts at that point about Afghanistan, or just that you saw things that later fed doubts? Yes, saw things that later fed doubts, and not so much about Afghanistan, but in terms of our government in general, our government's lack of intellectual honesty, our government's inability to take the blinders off and recognize what the reality of the situation on the ground is. And then adjust accordingly, basically do the right thing for the right reasons. A brief example is I remember sitting in a briefing, or reading a briefing in summer of 2003, I think it was July of 2003, so this is 4 months after the Iraq invasion, where things haven't gone very well. In Iraq, things are continually deteriorating, and you tell that from media reports. I could tell that from the personal reports I was receiving from my friends who were stationed in Iraq at the time, and as well as the official reports that we were getting through the chain of command in terms of how things were deteriorating and getting out of control in Iraq. I remember sitting at some point in July 2003 and basically seeing a briefing that said, regardless of what's being said, it's inaccurate. And by September of 2003, we'll be down to 30,000 troops. That even at that point, in the summer of 2003, just our senior leadership's inability to realize what the accurate situation was, to admit fault, admit mistakes, and to adjust. You saw that early there. And then, I get to Iraq in 2004, and you're being told you hear senior leadership make statements that there is no insurgency. And so when you have your leadership in Baghdad and in Washington, D.C. saying that there is no insurgency, well, that affects your policy, and that affects how you're actually able to conduct operations.
And how does this happen? Is it that there are people who know what the president wants to hear, and they don't want to be the ones who tell him the truth, and so they convey to their subordinates that what they want to hear is things that permit them to tell the president something? In other words, is it a bunch of people sending subtle signals down the chain about what they want to hear, and a bunch of people not having the courage to tell their superiors what they don't want to hear? How does this delusional psychology come to infest an entire bureaucracy?
I don't know, but I think you're spot on with that explanation, Bob. I think that's exactly what happened. The boss sets an agenda, the boss sets a goal, and people follow it for a variety of reasons. One, because they want to please their boss, or because they only have I've only got 6 months left in this position, and then somebody else will do it for a year and a half. So I'm not going to rock the boat because my next posting is in Hawaii, and I'll be done with this. There's a lot of political pressure that came out of the White House. You can see that when I first got to Baghdad, it was still run by the Coalition Provisional Authority. And that was a political operation. Nearly everybody there. I remember very clearly having conversations with people in Baghdad who were leaving, who had just spent a few months or 6 months or a year in Baghdad. And I remember so many of them, I'd say, well, what are you going to do when you get back? And so many of them would reply back and say, I'm going to work the Republican convention in the summer.
No, you've probably seen the documentary No End in Sight, right?
No, I haven't.
You really see that in spades.
I've got it on my Netflix queue. Once I send back
You've got like interns from the Heritage Foundation in charge of like rebuilding the infrastructure of Iraq and stuff.
Yeah. And I actually had a good friend of mine. The reason why I got that job in Iraq was because so at some point in I remember it was about the winter of 2004, early winter 2004, late winter 2003, and Rumsfeld got all upset because there weren't enough people staffing the CPA, and so he basically it went out throughout the Pentagon, and different Pentagon offices had to give up different people to staff the operations for it. And my buddy Ken, who's one of my good friends and still is one of my good friends, he ended up he was a surface warfare officer in the Navy. He ended up getting detailed down to CPA and working in the CPA's Human Resources Office. Basically, he was helping pick people to send overseas to Baghdad. And so I was getting out at that point, and that's a whole other story that's kind of funny. But I was getting out, and I was looking to go into either overseas construction, and I had some thoughts about working for an NGO or working for a larger company, or doing commercial construction back here in the States. And he said to me, "We're hiring for a lot of reconstruction positions with, the Army Corps of Engineers and Department of Defense over in Iraq. Are you interested?" And I said, "Absolutely. I'd love to do that. It'd be a good chance to, do some good, to help rebuild some things, and also it'd be a great career starter for me in terms of getting into the construction business." So, I ended up getting a position. But, talking to him about it, there was you were chosen to go over there based upon your political loyalties. And then I hear stories when you're in Baghdad, a lot of these guys only serve there for 90 days. And what would happen is they would go for 90 days, they would max out their overtime because they're all there on a temporary basis, so they earned overtime. They would go for 90 days or 120 days, max out how much they could get paid, because under the federal government you're capped on what you can get paid in a year. Mm-hmm. Max that out, and then basically go back to D.C. and kind of high-five, tag off with somebody else in their office or someone else on the Hill who would then go and replace them. And then they would do 3 or 4 months, max out their pay, and go back. And then they were walking around this town, wearing their desert boots with their suits on Capitol Hill, whatever nonsense that was for a while.
And so when you're in the military in Iraq and you're seeing people get killed mm-hmm. because of this kind of thing, that's got to kind of annoy you.
It is, and it starts as soon as you get there, when you kind of see what the priorities are, and you hear different, and you had all kinds of people that were just, you heard it, and I wish I knew I'd be doing this kind of thing now, because I would have taken better notes, and I wouldn't be able to relying off my memory, But I remember hearing guys say stuff like, well, after we're done with Iraq, we're going to turn right and go into Iran, we're going to turn left and go into Syria. And just like, or this is all, or you hear things about how this is all built to make sure the president wins again in 2004. Guys are out there dying and getting their legs blown off, getting their arms blown off, going home in a box. Families are completely destroyed back here. And you're wondering, what the hell is going on?
So you had a certain kind of doubt when you were in Iraq. Was it? I mean, to what extent did you carry that into Afghanistan, and to what extent is it just that in Afghanistan it was a whole nother set of perceptions that led you to doubt the Afghanistan mission itself? So there's a lot that I carried over. There are other incidents when I was in Iraq again with the Marines, or when I was working for the State Department on the Iraq desk, or when I was working for the Department of Defense here in D.C. before I went back to state to go to Afghanistan. And just seeing how distanced Washington, D.C. is from the reality of what's occurring in Iraq and Afghanistan, mm-hmm. and how much political agendas or other factors, bureaucratic agendas, have in our policies that actually affect our operations in both those countries. So I was, dismayed and jaded about it. But also, too, I was, like I said, my goal was to be a career civil servant in the government. And, I wanted to be loyal towards our government. And I also kind of felt along the lines of like, hey, you're at this level, you're a mid-level guy.
just keep slogging at it, and eventually you'll be a senior guy one day, and then you can try and be a good guy and try and make a difference and try and change things. Mm-hmm. But you need to put your dues in and affect what's around you. Take care of, if you got people you're responsible for, take care of the people you're responsible for. Make sure they get home all right, and then your operations around you, do them honestly and as well as you can. And don't worry about the things that you can't change. Well, I get to Afghanistan, and it just is not adding up, and this kind of gels with things I had read, as well as just interactions and conversations with colleagues or friends who had served there. That this just doesn't. This idea that the Taliban is a fringe insurgency, that it's a movement that is not wanted by the people of southern and eastern Afghanistan, just wasn't adding up. That there's just this quest or this desire for a central government presence in their lives, and we need to help them defeat these fanatics from taking power back. When I got there, it was pretty apparent to me fairly quickly that wasn't the case. And particularly, when I got to the east of the country, and in parts of the country, it was in parts of that country in the urban areas. So if you go down if your viewers understand that part of the country, down from Asadabad through the Asadabad River Valley into Jalalabad up to Medalam, that's a pretty successful area in terms of our purposes, in terms of commerce being established, in terms of education occurring, in terms of freedom of movement among people. It's pretty well, but it's always been like that, because it's been these river valleys that have always welcomed commerce and have always welcomed people going through them. When you get out of those areas, and that's not really where we're fighting too much. You get out of those areas.
That's relatively urban. Not urban in the sense of New York, but relatively
urban. By Afghanistan standards, it's urban. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to the split that you'll see in the Pashtuns, between the rural Pashtuns and the urban Pashtuns. Mm-hmm. Or if you go and find earlier texts about this, they'll make they'll say the mountain Pashtuns versus the valley Pashtuns, or so forth. So, but when you get out of these river valleys, and you go north, particularly in the province of the Kunar and Nuristan, in that areas where our troops have been very heavily engaged for the last 4 or 5 years, and you get up there, you realize that what we're doing is we're just occupying these valleys, that we've got this presence in the valley, and the people there are fighting us, not because they have any real connection to the Taliban, but because we're in their valley and they don't want to be intruded upon. They don't want to be occupied. And not only is it just not us who are in their valley who are occupying them, it is the central government who are now occupying and now trying to tax them, basically, by trying to regulate their timber trade or their gem trade. So, and they don't want that. And so what you find is you find yourself, seeing how our guys are getting killed and killing in return. And the people they're fighting are fighting us because we're there. And furthermore, we're making it worse because we're stepping into the middle, or we're backing one side in basically like a tax dispute. That should be an internal problem for the Afghans to deal with, not for U.S. soldiers. So you saw that pretty clearly and pretty early, and then that continued when I got down to the south of the country. And saw really the same type of things where our forces were occupying valleys and were being fought against because we were there. And the crazy thing was, for every valley that we were in, there were 50, there were 25 or 50 or so that we weren't. So it was just kind of this notion that we would, what is the purpose of this? This is crazy. This is Einstein's definition of insanity, because all we're going to keep doing is just keep occupying these places over and over again, and we're never going to get anywhere. You'd hear the soldiers say things along the lines of, because the soldiers got it, because they would say stuff like, hey, we need to start shooting at 12-year-olds. Not because they're cold-blooded and they want to murder children, but because the idea being that when we come back here 4 or 5 years from now, those 12-year-olds are going to be the ones who are shooting at us. So the soldiers got the inanity of it. The soldiers got the senselessness of it. What's the purpose of being here? That type of question. So it was very apparent to me in both the east and the south of the country that what we were doing there did not match up with what our leaders said we were doing. It certainly wasn't making the U.S. safer. It certainly wasn't benefiting the U.S. And it wasn't bringing democracy to the Afghan people either.
Okay, so there had been this long-standing tension between kind of rural and urban Afghanistan, and attention that maybe is hard for us in America to imagine because we've become this like consolidated country, but Afghanistan kind of never really did, right? I mean it doesn't have a history of centralized rule, and the rural parts want to keep it that way, right? And so
exactly.
So we're kind of stepping into what is almost, when it gets violent, a civil war, and we are defining ourselves as the enemy because we are associated with the urban part. So we come to the villages, the rural villages, and by their definition, we're already on the side of the enemy, right?
Correct.
And when you say they don't have, they're fighting us because we're there, and they don't have a strong allegiance to the Taliban. But I gather it is the case that, in many cases, they are ruled, these villages, by people who identify themselves as Taliban, right?
Correct. Or we identify themselves as Taliban. They might not. We tend to use the term Taliban as this, that covers a lot of different groups. It's a very big umbrella that covers a lot of groups. What you find, or at least what I found and what I saw in my assessments was that you get out and you talk to the local villagers, you talk to the local Afghan officials, you talk to our young, American officers who are serving in these remote outposts throughout the countryside, and you would see that, first of all, that their main thing that the people in these valleys wanted was to be left alone. They didn't want contact with people from the next valley over, let alone from people from the capital of the province or from the capital of the country or from other parts of the country or from 7,000 miles away. They wanted to be left alone. And that was something I saw trend very clearly throughout my conversations with both the east and the south of Afghanistan among the rural Pashtuns was leave us alone. The other key thing you saw was that, so what they do then is they end up then receiving funding and money from the Taliban now, and that's where we tend to lump them all together because there is an organized Taliban movement. It's headed by Mullah Omar, who was the head of the Taliban that we removed from power in 2001, and they operate out of they have safe haven in southwestern Pakistan, southern Pakistan, and they have a pretty organized command and control movement throughout southern and eastern Afghanistan. And what they do though is they will send their military commanders or their political commanders out into the countryside, and these commanders will provide funding to local groups. And each local group, say, is centered in a valley. And all these local groups care about is just maintaining control in their valley. So what you see is that these local groups are allied to the Taliban based upon, one, a shared mutual desire not to be occupied or not to be intruded upon by the central government or by foreign forces, and then the money that the Taliban provide to these local groups. And the money is, a lot of people get this idea of $10 a day Taliban, they're putting IEDs in the roads so their kids won't starve. There's an element of that, but what I saw more of was that this was bulk money delivered to leaders of local groups that because it's such a poor, desperate country, particularly the countryside, the rural parts, that if you have that money, you now have power and you now have control of your local area. Mm-hmm. But you would go to but these local groups wouldn't even interact with each other too much. And again, so both the east and the south. Up in the east, we had in the east, it's so all the valleys are so separate from one another that they actually speak their own languages in a lot of those valleys. And there was one time where
one valley, one language.
One valley, they will speak their own languages in those valleys. It's amazing. We shouldn't be sending soldiers into those valleys. We should be sending anthropologists because you have people that live so walled off from one another. In the year 2010, we should be researching them rather than trying to subjugate them. But so I remember one time we had one of our outposts get attacked, and we thought we heard on a radio intercept. We thought we heard Korangali, which is one of the valleys of the Korangal Valley. And it was a big deal because that outpost, even though it was only, say, 15 miles from the Korangalis had never left their valley to fight anybody. And we were mistaken, it wasn't Korangali, but that would have been a huge deal because these people don't leave their valleys to fight. They only fight us because we're in their valleys. I remember asking a platoon leader in Zabul, who was up in the mountains there. He just had about 35 American soldiers and probably about 10 Romanians and about 20 Afghan soldiers with him up there in the middle of the valley. And every time they left that position, they got attacked. And I said, within 5 kilometers, how many different local groups do you have? And he said about 5. And I said, do they ever work together? Do they ever interact together? Do they ever coordinate? Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. They don't. If push comes to shove, or if it's an extreme situation, they might. But otherwise, their coordination only occurs because they have a shared desire not to be occupied. But they certainly don't cross ridge lines to go fight with one another or coordinate. They want to be left in their valleys to run them themselves and to self-govern themselves, basically.
So it isn't just that, by your analysis, they're fighting us because we're there. It's also that because we're there, they have an incentive to be dependent on the Taliban, right?
Correct.
But yeah. So what in your I mean Taliban Central? We may label them as Taliban, but I gather we're labeling them as Taliban because they take money from Taliban Central.
Yep, and then they put IEDs in the ground and shoot at our soldiers and those kinds of things, yes.
And, I mean, first of all, do they represent Taliban ideology in any more thoroughgoing way? I mean, when the Taliban give the money, did the Taliban say, and we would also like for you to do, not let girls go to school or whatever else? Yes. I mean, is the Taliban managing to impose its ideology in these villages?
I think the Taliban have gotten very smart about this. The way I saw the Taliban operate was that they gave the money, they gave support. They said, hey, because in addition there would be like Taliban regulars. There'd be teams of 30 or 40 Taliban operating in the south who would move from place to place, and they were kind of like the Taliban's shock troops, so to say. And so they would go, if you had a problem, give us a call, and we'll come over and support you. But what I got was that, or what I understood was that there was very little guidance given by the Taliban to the local leaders, to the people that they were putting in their employ. They were giving them basically very much a hands-off type of. They would give them instructions. Hey, if you see the Americans or you see the Afghan Central Government forces, attack them. I think they were doing the burning of the girls' schools, but a lot of that stopped. I mean, you look at something I talk about later about this, but Greg Mortenson's new book, where he talks about going into Taliban-controlled area and building girls' schools. I don't think that's something that they're against. What you'll find is probably each valley is different. And each valley is governed by a different group or different set of leadership. And some may be aligned with Taliban goals and Taliban visions, that they want to impose this extreme sense of Sharia law on people. Others want to help the Taliban, reestablish an Islamic government in all Afghanistan. I think that's pretty rare, actually. Others have no affiliation with the Taliban, want to have more of a secular lifestyle, want to see their people prosper and have, but don't want to be ruled from outside. So each group is kind of different, and the Taliban let them do that because the Taliban know that they won't get that support from the people if they are too heavy-handed. And one of the things I've been saying is that if we declare a ceasefire and if we pull out of these valleys and stop fighting in them, all of a sudden that takes away the main shared sense of camaraderie between the Taliban and these local groups. If we remove ourselves from the picture, now all of a sudden the Taliban and these local groups don't have a shared enemy. And the Taliban probably is weakened politically in the south and east of Afghanistan by us entering into a ceasefire and us removing ourselves from those rural areas. I think we politically weaken the Taliban in both the south and the east of the country.
Yeah, I guess. And what is it that the U.S. is afraid would happen if we withdrew from the rural areas? They fear that the Taliban would maintain a kind of control. I mean, the Taliban would like to acquire turf, right? I mean, the Taliban would like all these villages as to be as subordinate to them as possible. But I guess what you're saying is if we weren't there fighting, the villages would have not much of an incentive to turn to the Taliban, right?
Correct. And I don't believe that. And like we saw, we just invaded Marja or assaulted Marja last month. It wasn't like the residents of Marja were lining up on the street and we're about to march and try and take Kabul. I think we have this fear that if we don't occupy them, then the Taliban will continue to grow in strength. I don't think that's the case. Look at since 2006 when NATO or ISAF start expanding out throughout the countryside. That's when the Taliban momentum supposedly began. I don't really believe, they gained momentum because we kept putting foreign troops in more places they hadn't been. As we added more troops to Afghanistan, we went into more valleys and more places we hadn't been before. And guess what? We found more people who are willing to fight us and who are willing to ally themselves with the Taliban because the Taliban will give them the support to fight us. We draw back from that. All of a sudden, the fighting is going to stop, and these people are going to go back to being left alone and self-governing themselves. And for the most part, these are extremely desperately poor people. These are people who are subsistence farmers. This is where your life expectancy is 44 years of age. This is where you want to have multiple wives, not just because it's tradition, because there's a really good chance your wife is going to die in childbirth. In some cases it's like 1 in 2 chance it's just going to die in childbirth. That your children, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 children will die before their 5th birthday. And they've had drought and they've had deforestation issues. So it's a very tough existence for them without the presence of armed occupation, without the presence of a 30-year-old civil war. So I think these people will just go back to wanting to be left alone. The other thing we haven't talked about this at all. We've talked a bit about the inter Pashtun strife or civil war.
Pashtun, the urban versus rural Pashtuns. But there's also
an ethnic,
other non-Pashtun ethnicities that have tension with the Pashtuns, I gather.
Correct, and that's a very serious problem, and that I think if there's one thing I would say causes the most strife, causes the most problems in southern and eastern Afghanistan is the presence of non-rural Pashtun soldiers and non-rural Pashtun police and in non-rural Pashtun civil government officials in these locations. Where I was in Zabul province, again, 300,000 people, predominantly rural Pashtun. We had 6 Afghan infantry battalions. 4 of them were commanded by men who didn't speak Pashto. They spoke Dari. There's 2 main languages in Afghanistan, Pashto and Dari, which is a Persian dialect that the northern tribes speak, and then also what the people in the urban areas tend to speak as well. So these were forces that were foreign, that were occupying the southern parts of Afghanistan, just as you would see the NATO forces occupying them.
And now in Marja, aren't we kind of repeating that mistake? I mean, this idea of a government in a box that we're rolling in?
That's my fear. That's my fear is we're doing exactly the same. And I didn't think it could get as bad as we actually did it. I mean, we brought in a man who had lived in Germany for 15 years, who had served 4 years in jail in Germany for attempted murder. It's just... the fact that we had American Marines assaulting Marja, and I forget how many we lost, but 14 or 15 killed, I believe. We killed anywhere from 30 to 60 civilians in the process. To put an ex-con in power, there's going to be a monument to this war eventually, and it'll probably take forever, like everything else does in this country, but... Then eventually there'll be a monument to this war, and they'll probably, like our Vietnam memorial, list the names of our fallen. And there's going to be names on there who died in this last month or two to put a carpetbagger who had served time in prison in charge of Marja. It's crazy, because then this goes back to my reasons for resignation. We're saying this on the one hand, we're saying this because we're bringing about democracy. We're saying to bring liberty to people. We're saying we're doing it to enable people to have self-determination and to have a more prosperous life or a better life. And then we do these kinds of things. How many of our kids died over the summer to ensure that democracy was going to happen in Afghanistan? And then the Pashtuns boycott it, and Karzai steals it. And or the rural Pashtuns boycott it, and Karzai steals it, and we've got probably about 100 kids died over the summer trying to do this, and so then we just move on to another explanation for why we're there, and so I'm just incredulous that we're at this point. And so, if you really want to get me going, start talking about Iran. and how after these two disasters of the last 10 years, we've got people here who see bombing Iran as the right way to go forward.
The good news is they're not talking about occupying it yet, I guess. But
yeah, I guess not.
So is Marja on the rural side of this urban-rural divide, or is it diverse itself?
No, it's on the rural side. I've never been there, but I know people who have been in that area, and from my knowledge of Helmand and everything, it's very rural. It's more rural than it was made out to be. I think we had some errors of language and word choice because it's not a city, it's not a built-up area. It's very much just a rural district, a rural agricultural district, a farming district. And they weren't bothering. Yes, it was a Taliban stronghold, but
right. That's the phrase you keep hearing in the media. What does that mean? What, in practical terms, what did that mean about
what did that mean is that yes, if they were Taliban, we were chasing out Lashkar, which is the capital of Helmand Province, or even those coming over from Kandahar, they could find refuge in Marja, but there was no senior leadership base there. This wasn't like the sanctuary that Pakistan had provided to the Taliban for these last 8 or 9 years. This was an area where, just like Dick Holbrook said a week or two ago, and he got in trouble for it, that this is an area where probably everybody has a family member or a neighbor who's in the Taliban. Because the Taliban, at that point, now you're getting into the rural Pashtun way of life. And the Taliban are ethnically and culturally similar to these people. So when they have to make a decision who they're going to support, are they going to support this central government that's composed of outsiders, that's composed of non-Pashtuns, that's composed of Tajiks and Uzbeks and Hazaras and Pashtuns from Kabul, or are they going to support this group that's ethnically and culturally similar to them? Of course they're going to choose that ethnic and culturally similar group. But, Marja, they weren't launching offensives out of there. They weren't going to line up on the road and march on Kabul, like I said earlier. Mm-hmm. If we left them alone, they were going to live in peace there. Yes, it's the center of the opium trade and everything else, but that's an issue that we need to address in a manner other than occupying the place with American Marines.
Okay, so then it sounds like, there are two kinds of fears you can imagine America having in the event that we should do what you think we should do and just withdraw from these areas or by offering a ceasefire or unilaterally withdrawing or whatever. One is that, as you suggested, they might say, well, the Taliban will acquire more turf and then eventually they will pose a threat to the urban areas. I think you're skeptical about that. But leaving that aside, the other kind of thing that you would hear is, there's the terrorist sanctuary problem. There's the Al-Qaeda. One thing I haven't heard you say anything about is Al-Qaeda, whereas I think in the American public's mind, a lot of this is supposed to be about Al-Qaeda, and people kind of half imagine almost that that's who we're fighting in Afghanistan. So in your experience, what is the connection between the Taliban as they actually exist in rural Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda?
Al-Qaeda was present in Afghanistan for 4 or 5 years prior to 9/11. That was where Al-Qaeda Central was, as we call them. So their senior leadership was in Afghanistan. And they, depending upon which book you read, and which source you go to, they either had a close relationship with the Taliban or they had a terrible relationship with the Taliban. I suspect that the Taliban had so little control of the country in reality because they were fighting the Northern Alliance and trying to maintain control of the country, that they didn't have time to deal with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's business. Mm-hmm. That they weren't, and they certainly were not involved in any Al-Qaeda operations or any Al-Qaeda planning. But again, it's as you have some folks, Ahmed Rashid, will in Descent into Chaos talks about how they had a pretty close relationship. And then you'll have, I just had Omar bin Laden's book, Osama bin Laden's son, just came out and said, no, the relationship was terrible. Mullah Omar wanted to kick bin Laden out a full year before 9/11. So you don't really know. What I do know is that after September 11th, we went to Afghanistan, and rightfully we did that. And we destroyed what was Al-Qaeda Central's operations there. And so they fled, they went around the globe, and a large chunk of them did go to Pakistan, where they've been operating out of for the last 8 years or so. They also evolved. They don't need Al-Qaeda's operations. If people go back and look at all their operations for the last 10 years, or most of the operations for the last 10 years. Yes, guidance and intent comes out of the senior leadership. It comes out of bin Laden and Zawahiri, and we should capture them. And it's a shame that we have not done so over the last decade. But that's really about it. The rest of the bulk of their operations, they're really just providing inspiration out of Pakistan right now. Then the operations are carried out either by individuals or by small cells that reside in the location where the attacks occur. And their connection to different parts of the Al-Qaeda movement or its associated movements worldwide is a virtual one. And there might be some face-to-face meetings occasionally, but certainly it's not this. They don't require these large tracts of land. They don't require any ties to a geographical or political boundary. It would be great. Hey, Bob, it'd be great if they did move back into Afghanistan and set up these large training camps again, because then we could find them and bomb them. But they don't need that. They don't require that. They need safe houses. They need cell phones. They need internet connections. And they need a handful of willing participants. They need a handful of people who are attracted to their ideology and who want to carry out attacks against the West or attacks against other Muslim nations to support that ideology. Mm-hmm. It's a very small organization. I mean, worldwide, there's maybe a couple thousand of them out of a Muslim population of 1.2 billion, mm-hmm. 1.3 billion. So this is it's really a military intelligence or a civilian intelligence and law enforcement issue. Our operations in Afghanistan are having no effect in Al-Qaeda. I think the only effect they're having in Al-Qaeda operations are giving credence to Al-Qaeda's message of we're defending the Muslim world against Western invasion and occupation. I think that's about the only thing our operations there are doing. And giving people like Major Hassan down in Fort Hood, or what's his name, was Azazi, the guy who was going to do the New York plot, mm-hmm. Impetus to do these attacks or try and carry out these attacks. And it's absurd how we're handling ourselves. The president says on December 1st at West Point, he says, I'm sending 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan to defeat Al-Qaeda. And what does Al-Qaeda say? I'm going to put a bomb in a Nigerian kid's underwear. And this Nigerian kid may have been radicalized in London. And we're going to put him on a plane. He's going to try and blow it up over Detroit. Mm-hmm. So it's absurd how we're going after Al-Qaeda. And then, another thing, since we're on a topic, this idea that it's a war is, again, it's something that doesn't sit well with me, doesn't sit right with me. I think most of your listeners would agree. These are, for the most part, murderers and criminals. They're not professional warriors. So to characterize them that way, it does a disservice, to our guys in uniform. But it also legitimizes them as well. And they shouldn't be. This should be really seen as a law enforcement and an intelligence effort, and it should be handled that way.
So in your time in Afghanistan, you didn't see any evidence that the places that we are calling Taliban controlled, however you want to define that, were serving as any kind of sanctuary for Al-Qaeda?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not. And actually, the only time I remember ever hearing anyone reference Al-Qaeda when I was there was working one day and was with a couple of tribal leaders. Mm-hmm. And the one was joking with me about the other one, pointing at him and saying, hey, that guy's Al-Qaeda, you need to give me money. Because that was our policy for so many years. Was we just, whoever people, we had this, like, large bounties out. So, yeah. I've heard numbers that the first 600 or 700 prisoners we took in Afghanistan were not captured by American forces. They were just handed over to us by the Northern Alliance or the Pakistanis. And so who knows? You just, and then all the different tribal vendettas and everything else. There are a lot of people we've scooped up and put in detention who just happen to have an enemy or an adversary or someone on the other side of a feud who got to us first and got our money first. So.
Yeah, which is kind of depressing.
Yeah, it is. It is. But Al-Qaeda doesn't need a safe haven in Afghanistan. They've got one already in Pakistan. They can have them in Somalia, Yemen, a handful or dozen other places around the world. And they don't need it. They've evolved, and they work in a manner that doesn't require large tracts of land. We want them to work that way, and I think our defense establishment and certainly a lot of members of our political class want them to be like that. But it's just not the case. It's not the way the reality is.
So you would like to see, you use the term ceasefire, you would like to see us actually propose like a formal ceasefire?
I think so, yes.
And what do you think would happen? How do you think that would play out?
It would also be, a ceasefire brokered with negotiations meant that bringing the Taliban leadership into some kind of power-sharing agreement in Afghanistan. So, and we've seen this from both sides now. You just had a man named Zaif write a book, My Life with the Taliban, and he's come out very clearly that time is now to negotiate with the Taliban. Hamid Karzai has made those indications, and he has invited the Taliban to participate in his upcoming Grand Council, which hopefully will be beneficial to the nation. Hopefully the Taliban do accept. But you've got to give these guys some reason to come to the table. I've been very disappointed with our leadership in this country, who have said the start point for negotiations to the Taliban is lay down your arms and embrace the Constitution of Afghanistan. Well, that's basically asking those guys to surrender. That's not a start point for negotiations. If you go to alamar.info, which is the Taliban's website, you'll see that it's full of a lot of nonsense. And I hope nobody's getting me wrong that I think these guys are good guys at all, because they're not. But they are the ones who... Look, we can probably militarily defeat the Taliban in like 5 or 10 years' time at a cost of a lot of lives and a lot of money, but we'll never politically defeat them in the south of Afghanistan or in the east of Afghanistan. So we have to accept that, and we have to realize that we need to bring political order back into Afghanistan. And without there being political order or political stability, as long as 30% of the Afghan population is not represented in the Afghan government, you're going to have strife, you're going to have conflict, you're going to have civil war. And you're not going to have any security, you're not going to have any development until you get political order. One of the things that I've mentioned before about Greg Mortensen, he went into Uruzgan province, I believe it was Uruzgan, and he built schools in Taliban-controlled areas. Well, girls' schools. Well, the reason why he's able to do that was because that is politically stable. That area didn't have a central government presence, and didn't have a NATO or U.S. forces presence. It only had, i.e., a Taliban presence, or a presence where the local people controlled the area. So it was politically stable. So he was able to go in there and build things and build girls' schools, which is counter to the narrative that we're saying, or our government says, that the rural Pashtuns don't want girls' schools. No, what they want is political order. They want to self-govern themselves, and then they will develop themselves after that. But so the key for me is ceasefire, if for no other reason that right now the fighting is accomplishing nothing besides more dead and just causing this being a catalyst for the cycle of violence to continue. And in negotiations at senior levels, top levels, to bring the Taliban into some kind of power sharing agreement, with the thought that, and again this would be my thoughts, that you need to reform the Afghan government. Right now it's a very centralized system. It's very focused on a heavy delivery of services, and which require a heavy rate of taxation. There are no institutions there to deliver services, and there's no industrial or economic base to support taxes. So it's not a sustainable government in any manner, and won't be for decades. So my thing is reform the government and devolve power so that you get some form of political order in that country, so you can get that country moving forward.
So is your view that even like Taliban Central at the highest levels in Pakistan, and I know it's a kind of amorphous thing, and there's different guys, but that even at the highest level there's no intrinsic conflict with American interests? In other words, their fundamental aspirations do not involve harming American interests unless we have troops in rural Afghanistan, basically, or...
Yes, and I think, like I said, I've mentioned their website earlier. You go to the website, you'll see their statements. There's a lot, like I said, a lot of nonsense on there, but there are some key things about how they have come out and said that they have no interest in interfering in other countries' business. There's been statements made by various sources saying that they would break with Al-Qaeda. And we're starting to get around to that. Our government... there's a time, a New York Times story on the 12th, I think it was, where, and I forget who the official was, senior administration official, says it's not a question of if we're going to negotiate, a question of when. And the sad thing for me is watching all this is that we don't need to do that. I think the Taliban are ready to negotiate, that they're tired. They've been at war for 30, 35 years. They will be happy being given a chance to self-govern themselves, to have control of their areas, to get those Tajik and Uzbek army and police forces out of South and Eastern Afghanistan and back to where they belong. I think that's what we would look at for our start point, and that's something that's agreeable to the Taliban, and I think it's agreeable to Afghanistan's future long term because that brings about stability, which is important for the area. I mean, you have to have a stable Afghanistan, in order to have any successful, India-Pakistan relationships or Iranian-Afghanistan relationships or anything like that.
And, okay, so suppose you kind of, in effect, give the rural Pashtun areas to the Taliban. It turns out not to be as horrible as a lot of people think. They've got no beef with America. They're not harboring terrorists. No doubt some of their social policies would be reactionary by our standards, but in kind of terms of just American interest, it wouldn't be a threat. What about the rest of Afghanistan, either the non-Pashtun parts or the urban Pashtun parts? Would those, well, A, would the Taliban want to take any of that, and B, would there be any realistic chance of it?
Yeah, I don't think, I think there's probably some elements of the Taliban that have this notion of retaking Kabul or making Afghanistan into the Islamic Empire, but I think those I think though there are also realists within the Taliban, and those Taliban that are also tired and want to just self-govern themselves again. What you would need involved in this is you would need some kind of peacekeeping force that would maintain order, as well as you'd have to have somewhere to make sure that you're sharing revenue fairly and transparently as possible, so that there is no reason for the Pashtuns in the south to feel like they have to attack the Tajiks in the north, and vice versa, because they're not getting their fair share of things.
So the peacekeepers would be where? Where would the peacekeepers be?
I think the peacekeepers would probably be in Kabul, and then in other areas, maybe in border areas between the different ethnic groups. So central Afghanistan, maybe in between, so you'd say like in an area between Uruzgan and Daikundi, so you'd be separating the Pashtuns from Hazaras. You probably need peacekeepers up in Kunduz, in Mazar Sharif areas where there are, in North Afghanistan, where there are pockets of Pashtuns living up there. I mean, people forget that. One of the reasons that, there's a couple reasons why the Pashtuns support the Taliban in the 90s. One of the first things I want to say, too, is that one of the things my assessment is that the Taliban wouldn't retake all of Afghanistan or even Kabul is because I don't think they would receive the Pakistani support that would enable them to do so. I don't think the Pakistanis would back them the way they backed them in the 90s with military and financial assistance. The Taliban are still going to be Pakistan's most favorite horse in the race there in Afghanistan, but the Pakistanis won't back them to the level that's going to destabilize Afghanistan. I think what the Pakistanis want to see, they want to see a stable Afghanistan, and they want to see a stable Afghanistan where India can't gain the upper hand. So if India is limited to just only working with those northern tribes, they can't control Kabul, and they can't interfere in the Pashtun areas, I think Pakistan's fine with that. And so if they have the Taliban in the south and east of the country as a bulwark against that, I think Pakistan's fine with that type of limited success for them, because they don't want to see a return to 1995, 1996. But one of the things, in the 90s when the Taliban were moving on Kabul and everything else, one of the things that why they had a lot of Pashtun backing was because the idea that a Tajik, a guy named Rabini, was in control of Kabul, which was the first time, ever. I think there had been one other point briefly, but where a non-Pashtun controlled Kabul was the rule of Afghanistan, and the Pashtuns wanted to take that back, as well as also too immediately after September 11th. When a Northern Alliance overran the Taliban with our support, you had some real bad war crimes committed against the Pashtuns by the northern tribes, not just against Taliban soldiers who were murdered in the hundreds and probably the thousands, but also against Pashtun farmers that were living in the north who were basically driven off their land and made refugees in Kabul and into southern Afghanistan. So there is this long-standing, this rivalry or this feud between the different ethnic classes there. It's long-standing, and I think that's why you need to find some way to resolve the political differences, create a political order, segregate these people, if you will, so that you can have a stable Afghanistan. And the interesting thing about that is no one there is calling for independence, no one is calling for partition, no one is calling for secession. They all want an Afghanistan. They just want their ethnic party to have more than the others.
So you think it can be a coherent nation ultimately, but it just has to have a very decentralized political system?
It does. It does. I would think your national government is going to be similar to how the king ran the country in the middle part of last century, where he reigned by not reigning. He really didn't tax. He didn't provide any services. He was a figurehead, more or less, but he provided that he was the king, and they all had a shared Afghan identity. He maintained a small army, but other than that, the different areas, the different regions tended to govern themselves.
Okay. Well, we're at about an hour, so we should probably wrap it up. There's one question I had left over. You mentioned Greg Mortensen, if that's how you pronounce his name, who wrote this best-selling book, 3 Cups of Tea, and now I think he's got another book out. And I'm just curious, you said he managed to get girls' schools built in Taliban areas, and it was because the areas were stable that this was possible. I mean, this would surprise some people that the Taliban would put up with it. And maybe this gets back to the question of what do we even mean by Taliban. So in what sense, in what sense were these Taliban who were saying, fine, build a girls' school, which is supposedly kind of contrary to their ideology to educate girls, right?
Well, I mean, the Taliban had a very the guys that took over Kabul in the mid part of the last decade, or I guess it was 2 decades ago now. It's 2010, but they had a very extreme version of the rural Pashtun culture and way of life, but and it was extreme, and they were terrible in so many ways, but. 2 parts to that. One, they didn't invent certain things. The harsh forms of justice, that occurs in rural Pashtun life, but that's the extreme. Their form of justice there is actually really pretty, is well accepted among the people. And 99 out of 100 times, it's the cases that are resolved, or you ran over my goat, or you built your fence on my land. Those kinds of things, and they're adjudicated quite well, and it's respected by the people and welcomed by the people. That kind of justice, certainly nothing and certainly the central government there has never delivered anything. And issues with women, that's the rural Pashtun way of life. Is that women are shut away, women are covered. Woman belongs to the man, and that's an inviolable part of his life. That's just his home, and his family can't be violated by any other man, and that includes interaction with or anything that could possibly be seen as possession. So those are parts of rural Pashtun life that we have to accept. And I say that, and seeing how terrible it was, and from my perspective, but. All these rural Pashtun men, they have, their wives are shut away and everything else, and if you're, they shut them away at the age of 12, and it's terrible. But I also see that every rural Pashtun man has a cell phone, or actually they have 2 or 3, because there's a couple of different carriers there. And that's the way you change those things. You change them over time with information, with access to the outside world. You don't change it with the barrel of a rifle. If we try and change someone's culture by force, well, that culture is just going to turn in on itself and just try and protect itself. It's going to recoil against us and ultimately will revolt against us. But if we help bring about a stable political process there that would then allow for security, development will then follow. And we will see, in not overnight, and you're probably talking 10 or 20 years or 30 years, but a change in life for the women and girls of southern and eastern Afghanistan.
Okay, well, that's a good note to end it on, and I hope we have a chance to find out before too long what would happen if it were stable and the people didn't feel threatened and there was engagement with the outside world. So thanks again for taking the time, and I appreciate that, and also I guess I appreciate your resigning because I'm sure it was a very hard decision and complicated your life in a lot of ways, but it does provide a kind of testimony that's just not available otherwise in terms of your contact with the actual facts on the ground there. So I think it's valuable.
Well, thanks, Bob. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll see you, well, probably on TV at some point. I've seen you there in the past, and in the near term, I'll see you on Blogging Heads. So,
okay, great.
Thanks again, Matt.
Thanks, Bob. You have a good one.
Okay, you too.